Congress is set to vote this week on a bipartisan agreement to suspend the debt ceiling and avert a potential government default.
World's largest economy, the United States of America, is running out of cash. And if they don't do anything about it before the 1st of June, the superpower could default.
A potentially catastrophic default, which can have a massive economic spillover all around the world.
There will be no default. It is time for Congress to act now.
American stocks closed in the red on Tuesday. Even Indian markets felt the heat. The Sensex dropped 200 points in today's trade.
President and House Speaker Kevin McCarthy reaching that last-minute deal to resolve the looming crisis.
That's the United States for you. They sneeze, but you catch the cold.
Hi everybody, on 1st June 2023, the United States of America was expected to default on its debt. And after a long debate whether they will or they will not, finally the United States has now suspended its debt ceiling limit in order to prevent its default. And while most people might think that the US default problem is over, what we fail to see is that this is a very, very big indicator of the US dollar weakening and the fact that the US economy is not far away from breaking down. In fact, if we look at the debt to GDP ratio, where 77% is considered to be the limit of safety, for debt to GDP ratio, India stands at 83%, UK stands at 99%, whereas the United States stands at whopping 134%. And if you look at this graph, this is the highest debt to GDP ratio which the US has ever touched in the past 150 years. And today the ratio is even more than the times of Great Depression, both the world wars and even the COVID. Every time the US has reached this debt ceiling limit, they have increased it further. They have increased the debt ceiling limit not once, not twice, but for the 78 times since 1960. So even though the US got away again with the Russian aggression, Chinese power, and India's fastest growing influence, one day the United States will default, and when they do it, it will not just shake the world economy but will also be a pivotal moment in the world's history, which might result in drastic shift in power. So to decipher this complex situation, it is very, very important to study this macroeconomic situation, because this moment will affect everything, starting from world powers to the stock market and to all the other commodities traded in international markets. So in this episode, let's try to understand that what the heck is debt ceiling, why it is so important in context of US, what happens when a country violates this debt ceiling, and in the next 10 years, if the US default, how this is going to impact the entire world's economy. To understand USA's situation, we first need to understand how countries acquire debt. So you see, like you and I get the home loan, countries also take out debt in order to grow. And there are three popular ways through which these countries acquire debt. First is through international financial institutions such as World Bank, IMF, and Development Bank. Secondly, they could take loans from commercial banks, wealth funds, and bilateral loans from other countries. The third way is to do it through bonds. Let's understand this with a simple example. In simple words, if US needs $1 trillion to run its economy, it will come with $1 trillion government bond at an interest rate of 3%. And it will split it into 1 million units, each costing $1 million. So once these bonds are released in the market, it might be taken up by government of China, which might buy $400 billion worth of unit. The citizens of USA might buy another $200 billion worth of unit. Companies like Blackstone Group might buy another $200 billion worth of unit, and government of Japan will also buy $200 billion of unit. This way, USA will now have $1 trillion in order to run its economy. And in return, the government will promise an interest rate of 3% to all the stakeholders. So every year, the US government will have to give out $30 billion in return to the investors, and depending on the unit that every stakeholder owns, they will get the return on their principal amount every year. And after a maturity of say 3 years, the government will return $1 trillion back to its shareholders. So the big question here is that why do these countries own US bond? Well, that is because it is very, very safe instrument, and it's very safe way to park your money. So this brings us to the question that why was this debt ceiling introduced at the first place? I mean, depending on the challenges the US government might be facing, they must be able to raise $20 trillion, correct? Well, unfortunately, that's not how economic works. The more the debt a company would acquire, they will become more vulnerable. So to put a limit to the debt the US takes, the US debt ceiling was introduced. As the name suggests, debt ceiling is a limit beyond which US government is not supposed to borrow. This is to make sure that they do not accumulate an unsustainable level of debt which might eventually destabilize the economy. So if they are crossing the debt ceiling, it's an indicator that the United States might be taking an unsustainable level of debt. And it's not a new thing at all. The concept of debt ceiling started way back during World War I, when the US debt shot up to 3.5% of its GDP to 30.2% of its GDP. Then again in World War II, it shot up to 103% of its GDP. But immediately after that, if you see, the debt to GDP ratio dropped and it came down to just 35.2% in 2007. But immediately after 2008 recession, it started rising again. After the COVID-19 pandemic, the debt to GDP ratio of US shot up to 98.2%. And now it is close to 135%. And this is mainly because of FY19 to FY22, the US government spending increased by 50%. And this is due to tax cuts, stimulus packages, and decreased tax revenues. And we all know how it's panned out, right?
California residents will see a gas tax rebate check in their bank accounts as soon as Friday.
These tax rebates aren't just happening in California, but nationwide. Almost 2/3 of states have enacted some sort of tax relief measure.
The White House is pitching a new $850 billion stimulus package.
Americans need cash now, and the president wants to get cash now. And I mean now, in the next 2 weeks.
Lawmakers have struck their own deal for a massive economic stimulus package. $2 trillion in relief, though, is the package that they came up with.
In recent years, the overall pot of cash in the Fed's control has grown sharply.
Expecting trillions more in stimulus from both the central bank and Congress.
The infusion of cash into the financial system has renewed concerns that inflation could surge.
This is the reason why today its public debt has shot up to $31.4 trillion, which is 134% of its GDP. And what's even more scary is that in FY22, the United States paid $450 billion in just interest. And in 2023, the same amount is projected to increase to $663 billion. So now do you see how quickly these interest rates is rising? Now, in order to give you an example, $663 billion is more than the GDP of countries like Sweden, Norway, and Israel. And now because they have taken too much of debt, that there is a chance that US might default on its debt, not now, but in the next 10 or 20 years. So the question is, what will happen if US defaults? And every time they get closer to this debt ceiling limit, why everybody is so worried?
This week, the American government could default.
The White House and House Republicans have just a matter of days to avert a catastrophic debt ceiling default.
The U.S. government reached its $31.4 trillion debt limit.
We are at our highest percent ever of in debt.
Worst case scenario is that the U.S. government defaults on debt interest payments.
America is literally on the brink of an economic catastrophe, a government default.
If they fail to do it, we will have an economic and financial catastrophe that will be of our own making.
Well, the best way to understand the consequences of default, it would be great if we look at what happened during the last time when US neared to the default limit in 2011. The most critical thing that happened during 2011 was the credit rating downgrade.
What's the risk if we hit the ceiling?
It would shake the basic foundation of the entire global financial system.
Even if Congress does reach an agreement on a budget plan, it may be too late to avoid lowering the rating on some American securities.
Economists now see the threat of a downgrade as high and rising.
The balance sheet, the income statement, whatever financial metric you want to look at for the United States of America is not improved by this deal. That's what you're saying.
Exactly. The S&P said that in addition to the downgrade, it is issuing a negative outlook, meaning that there was a chance it would lower the rating further within the next 2 years.
Now, if you remember, bonds are rated AAA, AA, AA+, and so on and so forth, which basically identifies the level of risk which these bonds carry. So the United States of America has had a very high credit rating, and until 2011, it was considered to be a super safe investment with a AAA credit rating. But after 2011, it dropped to AA. So normally people will like, what is AA and AAA? We are talking about United States of America. But that is an important aspect from economic point of view. In simple words, if a bond of $1 trillion has a AAA rating and is giving out an interest of 1%, and if it is downgraded to AA rating, it means that the bond has become more riskier in nature. So the investor would expect it to give out a higher return on investment, which will be around 1.45% to 1.5%. So for the same $1 trillion, while the US had to pay $10 billion years as an interest to investors in AAA bond with 1% interest, but for the same bond, if the interest increased 1.45% in AA rating, they will have to pay $14.5 billion. So now if you see, ladies and gentlemen, the cost of borrowing of same $1 trillion has increased because of the downgrade of credit rating. And this increased the cost of debt. Eventually, this all leads to drastic ripple effect on the economy of the country, and this has impact on every starting from development to poverty eradication to even healthcare. So like we do every time, let's try to understand this using a case. So let's say hypothetically there are two countries, country A and country B. Initially, country A had a credit rating of AA, allowing it to borrow at an interest rate of 3%. With this rating, the government issued $15 billion in bonds for various initiatives. And due to strong economic growth and effective policies, country A's credit rating improved from AA to AAA. As a result, the interest rates on new bonds decreased from 3% to 1.5%. So what immediately happened was that instead of paying an interest of $450 million, country A has now to pay only $225 million in interest. So this frees up an extra $225 million from debt repayment. And this amount can be invested in infrastructure, education, and social programs. So the citizens of country A will immediately experience a higher quality of life, right? Secondly, the improved credit rating would attract more foreign investments, and with more foreign investments, there would be more job creation, more technological advancements, and eventually the economy would grow at a faster pace. But contrary, if we look at country B, initially country B had a rating of AA. This allowed it to borrow at an interest of 3%. So the government issued $10 billion in bonds to various projects and programs. But due to economic downturn, country B's credit rating was downgraded from AA to just A. As a result, the interest on new bonds increased to 6%. So what immediately happened was that instead of paying an interest of $300 million, country B will be paying $600 million in just interest. So this means that country B will have to shell out $300 million extra, which will reduce its investments that would have gone into public services, health, education, and infrastructure. Secondly, the higher borrowing cost would strain the government's budget because now the government will have to shell out $300 million extra. And as soon as the foreign investors see this trend in budget, they would quit the market. So less foreign investment means fewer jobs, which will lead to lesser economic growth. So the first challenge of default is that your credit rating will go down, which will increase the interest rate, which will lead to less investor confidence, leading to fewer jobs and lesser economic growth. So now if this is very, very clear to you, then let's move on to the second challenge which default might bring. So to understand this, let's take a classic example of Sri Lanka. So Sri Lanka, for the very first time in its history, defaulted in 2022, and we all saw how it happened.
Running out of petrol, medicines, and foreign reserves. The once booming Sri Lanka is in a mess.
An economic crisis in Sri Lanka, which is becoming increasingly dramatic, with residents' life savings virtually disappearing into thin air.
Its government has been forced to default on its entire $51 billion of external debt.
Sri Lanka has officially defaulted on its foreign debt as it confronts its worst economic crisis in more than 70 years.
So there is soaring inflation, huge piles of debt, bleeding foreign reserves, and a tanking currency. Everything that could go wrong with the country's economy has gone wrong with Sri Lanka.
And this default led to three broader moves which came in Sri Lanka. So talking about number one, in Sri Lanka, the interest rate of bonds shot up from 4% to 16%. So if your credit rating falls, your interest rate might increase by 1 or 2%. But if you default, it might shoot up by 10 to 15%. So just like we saw in our previous example, 1.45% on $1 trillion makes it $14.5 billion in interest. So 10% on $1 trillion make $100 billion. And this could practically paralyze the entire economy. And not so surprisingly, this is what happened in Sri Lanka. Secondly, all foreign investors will become extremely scared and they will start selling off their investment. In Sri Lanka, they started selling their bonds as well as currency holding, because of which the value of Sri Lankan currency dropped drastically. Thirdly, because the bond interest would increase, the currency would fall. The stock market could come crashing, and this again what happened in Sri Lanka.
Sri Lanka has asked the International Monetary Fund for urgent help following a financial crisis that has engulfed the island state. It's halted its debt payments, stoking fears that its economy could be about to collapse.
Certainly things are going to get worse before they get better. We did not close the market because we are trying to dictate where market pricing should be. We would not have done this under normal circumstances.
So in short, the economy will spiral into a deterioration, and this will cause obvious problems like recession, job losses and poverty. This is what happens when a country defaults on its debt. So just like Sri Lanka, when the US economy will no longer be so powerful, without the ability to borrow, the government will have to cut the spending drastically, and this could lead to government shutdowns, layoff of federal employees, and it will affect everything from social security payment to even military spending. In fact, the experts predict that if US defaults, 1.5 million jobs could be lost in a week and 8 million jobs could be lost in longer run. The stock market could come down, dropping by 22 to 27%, and eventually the banks won't be able to give out capital easily. This means both the consumption and business will slow down in US. But like I said, we are talking about United States of America this time, not Sri Lanka. So the possibility of default for now is extremely low, but someday into the future, the United States might default, and when it happens, it will lead to a catastrophe because the world is now losing the confidence on dollar. And as we already know, de-dollarization has already started.
Countries across the world are ditching the US dollar.
For decades, the US dollar has been king on the global stage. But a growing number of mostly emerging market countries are pushing for a change, saying they want to de-dollarize their economies.
De-dollarization, that is the question about whether the US's reserve currency is at least losing market share.
Russia, India, China, South Africa are all ramping up their efforts to use local currencies for international trade and reducing the dependence on the US dollar.
Some experts worry that the dollar's dominance may be under threat.
And this brings us to the last segment of this episode, and that is to answer the question that if the US defaults, how will this affect the entire world's economy? Well, it will affect the world's economy in 4 different ways. First will be, just like 2008 crisis, it will create a series of domino effect which will be set in motion, and as the saying goes, when America coughs, the entire world catches cold. And today, Japan holds $1.1 trillion worth of US Treasury security, while China has another $859 billion of United Treasury securities. So if the money printing happens, it will deplete their investments. Number 2 would be US bonds are used as a benchmark for other debt securities, and it is used as collateral for many transactions. So basically, what big nations do, they actually use US bonds as a collateral to get loans from other banks. So if the US defaults, it could even lead to a liquidity crisis across the world. Thirdly, all the US trade partners will heavily get affected because US citizens will consume less, and since the US is one of the biggest consumer market in the world, it will heavily affect every country that trades with US. Finally, countries like Argentina and Zimbabwe that are currently using the dollar in place of their own currency will completely lose trust in dollar, and they will move on to another currency. And lastly, considering the new BRICS currency and the rise of digital yuan and digital rupee, we could be looking at the rise of another giant superpower, or even better, a cluster of nations that together will act as a superpower. So while the US will not default on its debt today, but someday this is bound to happen. And every nation, especially India, needs to be very well prepared for this D-Day. How and when this will happen, only the time will tell. That's all from my side for today, guys. If you have learned anything substantial and viable, please make sure to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and share it with your loved and dear ones so that they also know when US will default, what exactly the impact is going to be, and how well we need to be prepared in order to overcome the challenges which we might see in the market. Thank you so very much. I'll see you in next interesting DeFi. Till that time, hasta la vista.